Welcome back. I am John P. Today we're going to be covering 5 things that you may be doing, well, probably wrong with your watch maintenance. These are basic things that you may see in other videos online out there or instructions on some ways that you can take care of your watches, whether it's swap the strap, change the bracelet, size the bracelet, or just as simple as wiping the watch down. There are some things that I have learned even before Delray Watch, where we buy, sell, and trade watches. I have been also collecting for such a long time previously, before Delray Watch, into Delray Watch, and to today. And these things, I see the after effects and some of the negative things that they will do to your watch when the watches come in the door, both in the service center that we have, as well for the buy, sell, trade component of our business. So if you are a watch collector, I'm assuming that you probably are, stay tuned because these 5 things are likely to save you a little bit of a hassle with your watches. But before we do that, on the wrist today, I have a Gerald Genta by Gerald Genta Retrograde. I love this watch. It's a Gerald Genta Solo Fantasy with the Mickey Mouse motif on the dial. Very cool, and I love the jump hour functionality, including the retrograde there with the minutes. So the first thing that I think it's very important to keep in mind is when you are swapping a bracelet on your watch, many people just use a spring bar tool, and that should suffice, right? Or a paper clip or something like that to be able to compress the spring bar. Then you kind of use your finger to pop up one of the edges of the bracelet, and then you hold it there so the spring bar is kind of out, and then you go to the other side. I think if you've ever done this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. On certain watches, it can be an absolute mess, a nuisance, really difficult to pull off that way. Well, not only does that cause scratches on the backside of your watch, especially if it's precious metal or gold, or the alloy of metal is just softer, especially with vintage watches, but there is actually just an easier way to do this. They sell these tweezers, and they're made just for this, right? There are manufacturers of these things all the way from Bergion, all the way to just cheaper alternatives that you can find on AliExpress or Amazon. So use a pair of tweezers, and that way you can compress the spring bars, both sides of the spring bar at the same time, and save yourself not only the headache, but also the micro scratches on the back of the watch, because people will say their watch is new when they go to sell it, but then you see the micro scratches on the back, and you know, well, this is not new because they took the bracelet off and they didn't use one of these tools. So keep that in mind. And that takes us into the next thing. And the next thing is, just the size of a spring bar is not the only thing that matters. There's different types of spring bars, different shapes of spring bars, and these things matter. Now, I'm sure that off the top of your head or gut reaction, and even I thought like this once upon a time, hey, it doesn't really matter as long as the size, as long as it fits, it works. Well, that's not the case, because especially for some bracelet watches, there will be too much space inside of the hole in the end link of the bracelet that if the wrong spring bar that's not thick enough is put in there, and I know there's going to be so many funny jokes there in the comments below about the thickness and putting it in there. I get it, funny joke. But nonetheless, if there's too much of a gap, the end link is going to kind of wiggle around, and I've seen the ends of the bracelet just fall off from that kind of friction that's there. Now, it's not a guarantee that that will happen, but it increases the chances, and if you're dealing with an expensive watch, why not make sure you use the right spring bar? And with spring bars, they have the spring bars that Rolex used and some other brands that didn't have the edges on them that would be used when you had holes in the case, right? There are older Rolex models, and there's some watches even today that have holes on the sides of the lugs of the watch, and you can push in something into those holes, and that will, compress the spring bar ends, pushing the spring and the 2 pieces into the center part of that spring bar. And then you don't actually have to go about, using these tools and things like that I'm talking about. But if you use one of those spring bars that's meant for a whole lug case in a watch that doesn't have lugs, you have to break the spring bar, and that's really tricky because you're probably going to scratch your watch. I have even done this by accident recently on a quite an expensive watch, and it was kind of one of those scratch your head moments where it's like, how did I do this? And if you do something kind of quick, it's easy, it could happen, but trust me, watch out for this one, and keep in mind there are different types of spring bars. The next thing that you should watch out for, and you're probably already doing this, especially if you have a screwdriver set already in your home. There are many screwdriver sets out there, small screwdriver sets that come magnetized, but it's very important that when we're working with watches, we don't want to introduce any type of magnetic components or put the watch into any kind of magnetic fields, because the things inside of the watch, especially a little bit older watches that don't have, silicon components, which are not magnetic, if they're just using predominantly metal components, the magnetism of the watch is going to manipulate the functionality of it, and it's going to keep pretty bad timing, probably. That's why you have watches like the Milgauss, which are meant to have higher levels of magnetic resistance. Many watches today, think even the Ingenieur line, that's what IWC invented their watch for. So avoid the magnetic screwdrivers. I know many people like to use them for different things on the watches, but trust me, unless you have the ability to kind of troubleshoot magnetism in the watch, this would be a very big headache. Now, the next thing that you should watch out for is the Cape Cod cloths. The Cape Cod cloths are marketed as these polishing cloths, and I myself am guilty of using them in the past on personal watches as a little bit of touch-up. Though the thing to keep in mind is this only works with high polish watches, and not all high polish is the same. So these Cape Cod cloths work really well to give you kind of that mirror finish on metal. But if you use it on a brushed watch, use it on a Panerai, use it on something else, this is going to change the finish of the watch, make it look totally different. And I see this sometimes. People will use this on, for example, the older Bond Omega Seamasters, and the bracelets have a couple of different finishings on the metal, and someone will take a Cape Cod cloth to it, and then it turns all high polish, and you can see it right away between the blasting, the brushing, the polishing. It's all gone. It's just high polish. And to actually have someone that wants to take apart one of those bracelets and refinish it all, it's a bit of a headache for refinishers. I know one refinisher that I'm close with, and they absolutely dislike this particular job on this model. So stay away from the Cape Cod cloths unless it's super high polish, and keep in mind that the high polish that you may end up with is not necessarily going to be the high polish that you started with. So keep this in mind, but that's actually how these things work. And lastly, we need to talk about bracelet resizing. Some of the watches have, the pin or the pin and cotter methods of resizing bracelets. This was kind of an old school mentality, but a lot of brands today still use this. Seiko is a prime example. And even the Nautilus has used variations of this. The Omega Seamaster has. A lot of bracelets have gone to using screws to take out links, but not all brands and models have gone to this. And I can understand why. It becomes a little bit more complicated. It's easier, but more complicated. So with the pins, it's very important to use one of these bracelet resizing tools. If you try to put this bracelet for your watch in just your hand and try to hit it with a hammer and push out the pin, you're very likely to damage the bracelet or damage the pin. Now, they have these specialty tools, and they're inexpensive, probably $20, maybe even $10 US dollars on Amazon, and you can actually secure your bracelet in there. And some of them have a bit of a clamp and a vise where you can, it has a pin that you can push through the bracelet to push out the pin that's in there. And there are all different variations of this, where you can even use a hammer if you'd like. So I would recommend that. Please do not try this by hand, because if you lose one of those pins, you lose one of the pieces of the inside of a certain watch bracelet. Unless you send the watch back to the manufacturer, you may not be likely to get it. Some of the old Omega Seamasters, they would have kind of this system, and it would seem, oh, there's just a pin and an end piece, but they actually had some spacers in there as well. So pretty frequently, we get in some end links with all the missing spacers, and the bracelet will fall apart without the spacer. So don't do this. Please don't do this. You'll miss the pins. You'll have to send it to Omega. You'll have to wait 6 to 8 months, something like that. The spacers are just not available. It's proprietary for the bracelet. Happens for other brands as well. So please take notice of that. And if you don't have the tools, or if you just don't want the headache, most of the boutiques or authorized dealers are glad to do it for you, and they do it all of the time. So it's really no big problem, and it saves you the headache, especially the nightmare of losing a screw or something, or one of the pieces of the bracelet and having to find it. You can't find it. It's in your carpet. It's a whole nightmare. I know many people, I'll probably see in the comments below, have gone through this. So these are my recommendations for the bracelet resizing as well. But what do you guys think? Are there any other kind of gotchas that you've noticed over the years of watch collecting, or simple things where maybe it seems simple, but there's a little bit of a nuance, a little bit of a twist? I would love to see it and hear it in the comments below. Please do not forget to thumbs up, like, and subscribe. You can find me on Instagram, The Real John P. And of course, do not forget to check out delraywatch.com, where we buy, sell, and trade. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time. You've been chatting with John P.